Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray is a novel that explores themes of aestheticism, morality, corruption, and the consequences of vanity. The story follows the life of a young and exceptionally handsome man, Dorian Gray, whose life takes a dark turn after a fateful portrait session. The novel begins in the luxurious studio of Basil Hallward, a talented but reserved artist who has become deeply fascinated by a young man named Dorian Gray. Basil's admiration for Dorian's beauty is so intense that it influences his artwork, making the portrait he paints of Dorian the best work he has ever created. While Basil is finishing the portrait, he is visited by his witty and cynical friend, Lord Henry Wotton. Lord Henry, an aristocrat who delights in controversial and hedonistic ideas, sees Dorian as a blank slate, a young man who can be molded into an ideal devotee of pleasure and self-indulgence. As Basil completes the portrait, Lord Henry engages Dorian in a conversation about the fleeting nature of youth and beauty, telling him that those qualities will fade with time. Deeply affected by these words, Dorian becomes obsessed with the idea of eternal youth. In a moment of despair, he wishes that the painting, rather than himself, would age while he remains forever young. Unbeknownst to him, this wish is granted mysteriously and supernaturally. Dorian is soon swept into Lord Henry's philosophy of hedonism, dedicating himself to pleasure and aesthetic experiences. His first significant moral test comes when he falls in love with a beautiful, talented actress named Sybil Vane. Sybil performs in a small, run-down theater where she plays classic Shakespearean roles with extraordinary skill. Dorian sees her not as a real person but as a work of art, a living embodiment of beauty and perfection. Enchanted by her talent, he proposes marriage. However, when Sybil, overcome with love for Dorian, finds that she can no longer act because her emotions are now real, Dorian is disgusted. He sees her as nothing more than a disappointment, a woman who has lost her artistic value. Heartlessly, he rejects her, telling her that their relationship is over. Devastated, Sybil commits suicide. That night, Dorian notices a subtle change in his portrait. The expression of his painted self has turned cruel. This realization confirms the supernatural nature of his wish. While he remains physically unaltered, the painting will bear the marks of his sins and moral decay. At first, he feels guilty over Sybil's death, but under Lord Henry's influence, he quickly rationalizes it as an artistic tragedy and moves on. Over the years, Dorian plunges deeper into a life of excess and moral corruption. While he remains youthful and beautiful, his portrait grows increasingly grotesque, reflecting his sins, cruelty, and degradation. Rumors about his immoral behavior spread, and many who associate with him suffer misfortune. He indulges in every kind of pleasure, experimenting with opium, manipulation, and the ruin of others' lives. Despite this, Dorian maintains a public image of innocence and respectability. He even distances himself from Basil Hallward, who remains unaware of the extent of his transformation. However, one evening, Basil confronts Dorian, expressing his disappointment and urging him to redeem himself. In response, Dorian decides to show Basil the truth. He takes him to the hidden room where he keeps the cursed portrait, revealing the hideous transformation that has occurred over the years. Horrified, Basil begs Dorian to repent. Instead, in a fit of rage, Dorian murders Basil, stabbing him to death. This marks Dorian's complete surrender to evil. To cover up his crime, he blackmails an old acquaintance, Alan Campbell, into disposing of the body using chemicals. After Basil's murder, Dorian becomes increasingly paranoid and haunted by his actions. While walking through London's darker streets, he encounters James Vane, Sybil's brother, who has been seeking revenge for his sister's death. James tries to kill Dorian, but upon seeing that Dorian appears far too young to have been involved in Sybil's tragedy, which occurred nearly 2 decades earlier, he hesitates. Dorian, exploiting his unchanged appearance, convinces James that he must have mistaken him for someone else. However, a woman later informs James that Dorian has not aged at all in 20 years, confirming his identity. James stalks Dorian, determined to kill him, but fate intervenes. While hunting on an estate, James is accidentally shot and killed by another hunter. Though relieved, Dorian is shaken by how closely he escaped death. This incident pushes him into further self-reflection. He wonders if he can still be redeemed and briefly considers reforming his ways. In an effort to turn over a new leaf, Dorian decides to do what he believes is a good deed. He refrains from seducing a young village girl. However, when he checks the portrait for signs of improvement, he is horrified to find that it has only grown uglier, revealing hypocrisy rather than redemption. Realizing that his soul is beyond salvation, he falls into despair. In a final act of desperation, Dorian picks up the same knife he used to kill Basil and stabs the portrait, hoping to destroy the evidence of his corruption. However, instead of damaging the painting, the act brings about his destruction. Servants hear a scream and break into the locked room, where they find a shocking sight: a hideous, withered old man lying dead on the floor, unrecognizable except for his rings. Beside him, the portrait has reverted to its original form, showing Dorian as a young and innocent man. Commentary. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray is a profound exploration of the dangers of aestheticism, moral decay, and the duality of human nature. Through Dorian's descent into corruption, Wilde critiques the obsession with beauty and pleasure at the expense of morality. The novel suggests that an unexamined life driven purely by indulgence leads to self-destruction. Lord Henry represents the seductive power of hedonism, while Basil symbolizes the conscience that Dorian ultimately rejects. Ultimately, Dorian's fate warns against the dangers of vanity and the pursuit of pleasure without ethical consideration, reinforcing the idea that true beauty must be accompanied by moral integrity. The novel remains a timeless commentary on human nature and societal values.